Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to be upgrading the Villain by Heybike, starting from the easiest upgrades and working my way up to the harder upgrades. The first upgrade is to plug in a far driver Bluetooth module. This will allow you to tune any settings you want in the controller. To plug the Bluetooth module in, first take the seat off and then dig around above the controller until you find this plug. Once you found it, plug the Bluetooth module in and add some foam or whatever else to stop it from rattling. Next, download the FarDriver app and go to the COM page. Turn the bike on, click your controller and click Connect. You may have to log in at this point. Click Password OK Connected, then click Bound. If it works correctly, it will say it's bound and then say Owner Connected. After you're bound to the controller, you can take a look at the stock settings. I've included them all here in case I or someone else following this tutorial messes the settings up and wants to go back to stock. Right away, I noticed that when I have my phone connected to the controller, the display won't work. However, this isn't a big problem because once you disconnect your phone, it'll work fine. When looking over the settings, I noticed the power and the speed settings were a bit weird. The high and low power were fully maxed out, but the middle power was only 80%, which doesn't really make that much sense. The speeds were also super limited, with the fastest speed being the high speed at 40%. This doesn't make sense, since if I max that speed out, there's no way I'll get more than double the motor RPM, so I decided to rev the bike up to see what it was limited to. You can tell the motor is electronically limited because it goes to that exact same RPM every time you rev it up. So I'm going to go ahead and change these settings. For the power settings, I like to do high at 100, middle at 50, and low at 25, so that whenever you go up a mode, the power doubles. For the speed settings, I like to just max them all out, since you can't go super fast with the lower power in mode 1 and 2 anyways. Always remember to save. Now that the bike isn't speed limited, I decided to screen record the graph page on the FarDriver app so I can see what power I'm getting. With the full battery, I was only getting 3.5 kilowatts of power, which seems a bit low, but it turns out that's because the controller was only set to 70 amps. To set it to 80 amps, go to the Pro mode, then go to Parameters to max line current and type in 80. Always make sure to save after making any changes. I did another test run and confirmed that the controller is now pulling 80 amps. That extra little bit of power and speed is nice, but now it's time to do something that'll really help this bike ride better, which is enable regen. To do this, select Energy Feedback and choose EABS Medium. After that, save and go to the Pro mode. In the Energy Regenerate section, set Stop Back Current and Max Back Current both to 15. You can do less than 15 if the regen's too strong, but I wouldn't recommend doing more than 15 since I didn't test that. After doing that, set all the percentage values to 100 and then save. After doing all these changes, I can now accelerate with the full 80 amps of battery current up to a higher top speed, and then when I want to slow down, I can drag the rear brake and get slightly more than 15 amps of regen. This makes riding the bike so much better. Now that the easy upgrades are done, it's time to move on to the medium upgrades, which involve taking the bike apart. The first thing I want to take off is this front panel, because it looks like I can probably remove the battery once I remove this panel. Sure enough, once you remove the 4 bolts that hold on this panel, it'll pop right off and let you remove the battery. Don't lose the little washers that are under the bolts. With that panel out of the way, it's time to pull out the battery. It was kinda hard getting it from this side, but I realized I can just push it from the other side. Once it's loose, it'll slide right out, but you have to be careful. You want to have something to put it on so it doesn't hang by the wires. After that, it's easy enough to pop the 2 connectors off. The main power connector has this lever you can pull that pushes the connector out, which is really convenient. The charge port connector just has a little nut you have to twist off. Here's the bike with everything stripped off of it. The battery and all these panels are all held on by the same size Allen bolt, so you just need one tool to take it all apart. The first thing I want to look at is the motor. It's the same length as an MY1020 motor, but it's got a larger diameter with some fins on it, so it should be able to handle a good amount of power. Moving up to the controller, you can see the 52 volt 80 amp far driver controller with a bunch of connectors. This controller is a pretty standard size for far driver controllers. There's a 72 volt 100 amp controller that's this exact same size, so I'm going to order that to upgrade this bike. Taking a look at the other side of the motor, we can see it's a direct drive motor, so there's no belt or gearbox. I believe this space up here can have a Bluetooth speaker option, but I didn't get that. Here's the numbers on the side of the motor. I looked them up and I didn't get any results. Now comes the medium difficulty upgrade, which I already mentioned is going to be installing a 72 volt 100 amp controller. This controller has the exact same dimensions as the stock controller, so it's going to be pretty straightforward to install. The only thing I was worried about with installing this new controller is that I didn't know if the display or headlights can handle 72 volts, so I emailed the company and they told me the display and headlights can both handle 72 volts, so that's awesome. The first thing to do is to pop the far driver harness off of the old controller. You can do this by sticking a flathead in there and prying up while pushing in the little tabs on the side. Now you can go ahead and unbolt the plate that the controller is mounted to with the 4 bolts on the front and 4 bolts on the back. Once the controller's loose, you can take this cover off and unbolt all the phase and battery wires. Once that's done, you can take the controller over to your workbench or wherever is more comfortable and unbolt it from this plate and bolt the new controller on. Before installing the new controller, you should check that all the pins are straight. On my controller, a few were bent, so I bent them back into place. After that, you can do all the steps in reverse to put your bike back together with the new controller. However, you won't really get any performance increases since the battery is the limiting factor. So I'm going to skip straight to the hard upgrade and make a custom 72 volt battery using the stock battery case. The first thing I did was take the 6 screws out of the side of the battery case and then pull the top off. Now we can take a look at the stock battery. I like the way this is designed because it has these connectors which allows you to fully separate the top of the case from the battery. Once I removed all the stock insulation, I took a look at the BMS and the cells. The BMS is actually a 90 amp BMS, so you could maybe get a little better performance with the new controller, but it's not going to be much. I really like how these cells are laid out. It starts here and goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4. Doing it like this allows each cell to have their own piece of nickel strip, which means this battery could probably handle 100 amps discharge if the BMS let it. What I don't like is how the main positive and negative wires are attached to the nickel. On the main positive, it's only attached with 2 wires, which is pretty bad, but then on the main negative, it's only attached with 1 wire right in the middle. Attaching the wires like this means that all the current is forced through 2 or 3 nickel strips, which could create a hot spot if you really push the battery. I'll fix this in a later video when I use this battery on a build. Enough about the stock battery, it's time to make my own. I started laying out what I think would fit in the battery case, which is 3 layers just like this. I actually happen to have all the materials I need to make this battery. I didn't even have to order anything. The cells I'm going to be using are Molicel P28A cells. These cells are a little higher capacity than the stock cells and a lot higher current. Here's the spacer layout that I figured out would fit in the stock battery case. It's going to be a tight squeeze, but I think I'll make it fit. This is a weird layout since it's 3 rows of 10 and 3 rows of 9, but I figured out how to make it work. The middle is the parallel groups, and then the top and bottom are what the copper sheets are going to look like to connect the parallel groups. It's not perfectly balanced, but with how much copper I'm going to be using and how high current these cells are, I don't think it's going to matter. Here's the BMS I'm going to be using. It's 80 amps continuous and 200 amps burst. Since my controller is only 100 amps, this should be plenty. I think the BMS should be able to fit in the top of the battery case, which will save me a decent amount of space for all the cells. Once I cut these little tabs on the end, I think it'll even fit all the way in the top, which will be good because it can heatsink to the case, which should help keep it cool. The first thing I'll do is remove these connectors because they're just in the way. Then I'll cut those tabs off the BMS and see if it'll fit. Once I cut those tabs off the side of the BMS and filed down the edges to make them smooth, I also desoldered the wires and the BMS fits perfectly. It drops right down to the bottom and it'll slide back and forth easy, but it has no slack at all forward and backward, which is great. Now that I know the BMS is going to be out of the way, I can start assembling the 3 bricks that'll make up the pack. To do this, I grabbed 8 cells at a time and individually voltage and resistance tested them to make sure they match the datasheet. I then put them in the spacers according to the diagram I made and then Kapton taped them together. I then double checked that they would fit in the battery case. I'm only doing 6 parallel groups on the bottom because 7 times 3 is 21 and I only need 20 cells in series for a 72 volt battery. However, this leaves a gap on the bottom, so I'm going to take an empty roll of Kapton tape and cut it up and shove it into that gap so it can support the top cells. I then started spot welding some copper on with the copper-nickel sandwich technique. However, halfway through I realized I was not getting good spot welds because they were popping right off. I only got one on that whole piece. It turns out that this happened because there's too much surface area on the tips of my spot welder. The tip would oxidize, so I'd sand it down a little bit to get back to pure copper, but after a while of doing that, the tip got so wide it just wouldn't spot weld, so I had to sharpen them like a pencil on my angle grinder and they're back to doing good welds. A good tip when cutting copper in weird shapes like this is to get some extra spacers, put them on the pack, and then mark out what you need with some extra cells. After that, you can transfer it to a piece of copper and cut it out. After spot welding as many pieces on that I could with the packs separate, it was time to connect them. I've never done a double fold before, so I gotta think about how to do this. This spot's easy because it's on the top, but the other one's on the bottom, so I can't do it all at once. I think I'm going to have to do this connection first, then fold it and do the other connection. Once I got the first fold connection done, I started to think about the dividers that are going in between these different bricks. I decided that I'm going to use these dividers from the stock pack, but they're super thin, which may cause the fold to be way too sharp, which could rip it. So I did a quick test piece like this, and sure enough, it's a super sharp fold, which I don't want. So I'm going to put a layer of fish paper on each side of the divider. Another thing, when you're using these bare cells, you gotta be careful because you can short them out pretty easily. When I was messing around with this, the two ends touched right there, as you can see, and that shorted them out, so I can't use these cells anymore. Once I did the first fold, I put together some cells and spacers to act as a platform to hold up the third brick so I can spot weld it on. Before I did the first fold, I also made sure to spot weld a really long piece of copper on the main negative part of the pack so it can go up the side of the battery pack to the top. Once I did the second fold and spot welded another piece of copper on the main positive part of the battery pack, the spot welding was done. At this point, I decided to check if it would fit in the case again. However, I realized that there's no way that the top brick was going to fit with the lid on because the sides go in a bit to go inside the bottom part of the battery case. It'll almost fit this way, but it'll definitely not fit the long way. So I decided I'm going to have to cut these side parts out just to give a little extra room. Once I do that, I should have plenty of extra room on the sides, and I can still bolt it with 4 bolts, which is pretty good. I made sure to only cut out what I needed to, so I was able to leave these corner pieces, which should help it be more sturdy. Now on to the BMS. I soldered on some wires that should be the exact length that I need. Next, I added some foam pieces on top like this. These are here to hold the BMS up into the top of the battery case. I'm leaving this gap here for the balance wires. With these 2 pieces, I think it'll be tall enough to sit on the top of the pack and be pushed up into the battery case. Here it is with the balance wires and temperature sensors installed. I'm not plugging in the balance wires yet because I need to test them after I solder them to the pack. After that, I soldered on the main positive wire, and then I made a big mistake. I was pulling off some temporary tape, and I accidentally pulled the entire divider off. This is really bad because it caused these 2 parallel groups to short out right here. You can see it totally melted the copper in a couple spots. If that was the only thing that happened, I wouldn't consider it that bad, because I can just clean up the copper and use it as is, but on this side, 14 parallel groups shorted out. This caused the copper to get obliterated in this section. I thought I surely was going to have to replace these 2 cells on the end that have almost no copper connecting them anymore, but the more I looked at it, I realized the cells are totally fine. After all, these cells are designed to dump a ton of current, so it probably just blew the copper apart and the cells didn't care. So I decided I'm going to pull that copper off and put some new copper on and just call it a day. The cells didn't lose any voltage from sitting for 2 days after I disconnected them like this, so I'd say they're fine. Here they are with the new copper. I made sure to do a couple tear tests to make sure that these spot welds were good. After that, I added some solder to the main negative copper piece so I could solder on the BMS. Luckily for me, the part that I needed didn't get melted when it shorted out. Then I realized the BMS wasn't high enough, so I added this super squishy foam underneath it all so it can act like a spring and push it up into the top of the battery case. Now it's time for the balance wires and temperature sensors. On this side, I just added 2 temperature sensors since there's no balance wire connections. After that, I added a piece of fish paper. That other side was easy, now this is the hard side. Just like on the other side, I added 2 of the temperature sensors. After doing that, I started working on the balance wires. This was an absolute puzzle to do because I had to make sure there was no high spots that would rub on the battery case. Then I got my multimeter out and checked the voltages on the balance wire plugs to make sure I wired it all correctly. Now with the balance wires plugged in, I can boot up the BMS by attaching a charger. At this point, I set all the settings in the BMS because I didn't know how good the signal would be inside the metal box. After verifying that everything was working, I added a couple layers of fish paper on the sides to make sure it's really snug in there and it won't bounce around. I then decided I'm going to add this piece of foam that squishes super thin to one side to make sure it doesn't bounce around that way. And then of course the BMS will hold it down on the top. Speaking of the BMS, I decided to add some thermal tape so that the BMS can transfer its heat to the case more efficiently. Now it's time to jam this thing into the case. As you can see, the BMS is being pushed up against the top, which is what I wanted. After I clamped it down and screwed the screws in, I added a bunch of silicone sealer stuff to make sure no water gets in. After that, I soldered on the connector and this battery was good to go. Here's a quick comparison of the stock 52 volt battery, the upgraded 72 volt battery that I just made, and the 76 volt battery I could have made if I put that extra parallel group in and I used a BMS that let these cells do their full discharge current. To install the battery in this bike, I made this wiring harness. It's got the 2 main wires that go straight to the controller, and then the 2 auxiliary wires to power the ignition, or the headlight, or the screen, or whatever else. Then I have the stock battery wires that will be soldered to the charge port, which is fitting because I can now charge the bike with the same amount of power that it had stock. Here's a look at the new controller installed in the bike with the battery harness. For the charge port, I wanted to keep it in the same spot, but I can't just shove an XT60 in like this, it would look too wacky. So I decided I'm going to grind that part down flat, then add a little piece of plastic there so I can bolt it all on. I went ahead and installed the battery, but before I put this piece on, I realized that I could upgrade this. This piece is so overkill to hold this battery in, and it would make sense if it was trying to stop rocks from hitting the battery, but there's holes in it, so it's kinda weird. I decided to switch it out with 2 aluminum pieces. These are still pretty overkill to hold this battery in place, and they're about 1.5 pounds lighter than that stock panel, so I guess that's an improvement. With all the panels installed, the charge port installed, and those aluminum pieces on the front, this bike is looking better than ever. This spot is the perfect spot for an Econic Cycle sticker because you can't see it with the seat on, but if you want to look at the controller, you'll know where I got it. This bike is a total sleeper now with double the stock power. You can only tell it's been upgraded if you look really close. I thought about painting the aluminum pieces black, but they match the front and rear suspension, so I just left them. Now that this bike is done, it's time to put it to the test. I decided to take it to my grandparents' house. It was dark when I got there, but I decided to take a quick little ride. For some reason, I thought it would be a good idea to ride it down this muddy road, but it was not a good idea. I made it about halfway down the road, and then the bike completely locked up from this insane mud. I've never seen mud like this. I scooped all the mud out of the rims barehanded, but after only about 10 feet, it was back to being fully packed. I tried to escape the mud by going up through the field, but that just got a ton of tall grass shoved in there too, which made it even worse. I ended up having to carry the bike up a rocky hill away from the mud, and then rip out all the mud and grass. I even had to put the bike in reverse using the Far Driver app and go full throttle to try and sling some of the mud out. Eventually, I got it just enough so I could ride it, so I rode it back to the house and washed it off with the hose. I thought that was enough for one night, so I plugged it in so that it would be fully charged for tomorrow morning. As you can see, there's a big difference from stock. This thing pulls really nice now. my opinion, this extra power and speed is exactly what this bike needed. It already would have been fun for kids to ride around on, or adults to ride around at lower speeds because it had decent torque, but it just didn't have the top end. Now anyone could hop on this thing and really have fun riding at any speed. The bike will also no longer run out of power on super steep hills. Either you're making it up the hill or you're looping out. That first little hill was too easy. Here's a real challenge, riding up the side of the dam. This is about 40 degrees, so it's pretty steep. After filming those clips, I ripped around until the battery was dead. The battery, motor, and controller were all nowhere near overheating, so they should last a long time in this configuration. Now, the next part of this video requires some explanation. While I was building this bike, I was trying to sell the electronics from my recent go-kart build because I was not getting any good offers on the go-kart as a whole. As I was creating the listing for the electronics, I had someone message me on Marketplace saying how they saw my dual motor MX650 build and thought it was neat. They told me they had a KX65 they wanted to do an electric build with, so I told them, hey, I got all your parts right here. They told me that they would buy my parts, but they don't have a way to mount the motor, so I told them to just bring their bike to my shop and I can help them mount it. While they were on the way, I decided to start working on the motor mounts. The old seat from my Stealth Bomber seems to be a perfect fit for this motor. After I chopped up that bottom piece, I put the stock bracket on it so I could trace out where I needed the holes. After I got those holes drilled, he got here and we got to work. The mounts don't look the prettiest, but they should be super strong, and that's a lot more important than aesthetics. After we did this, he had to leave, but a week later he invited me to a Rideout and said I could also rip his bike around since he had finished it. The bike was pretty fun, but the gearing was a little too high, so you didn't have much torque until you got your speed up. However, there was a benefit to the high gearing. It was super chill to wheelie. You just hit the gas and it lifted right up. It didn't feel like it was trying to buck you off at all. This is my first ride on this bike and I can wheelie it no problem. After trying that bike out, it's time to take the villain to my first ride out. There's more than 30 people here, which is a lot more than I expected. This was a pretty cool experience, however it could have been better. The whole group kept arguing about where to go, and then everybody kept getting split up, so we only spent about half the time actually riding. The guy who bought my old stunt e-bike was also in this ride, so it was cool to see that bike still on the road. I asked him how it was doing and he said it's working great. This is my first ride out.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's kind of a shitty one right now.
Yeah, yours a little big. A few days after the ride out, I decided to go riding with my brother at the off-road trails and really put this bike through the paces. This is the steepest hill climb here. It had my brother and I both worried, but it turns out it was no problem. I also filmed a couple YouTube shorts while we were here because Heybike wanted me to. You should be able to find them easily enough because I don't post many shorts. Anyways, that's about it for this video. If you're interested in getting a stock Heybike villain or the controller I used to upgrade it, I'll have the links in the pinned comment and description. Also, if you have a keen eye, you may have noticed that the stock display hasn't worked since I upgraded the controller. I looked all around to try and figure out how to make it work, but I just could not find anything. This is just something to keep in mind. If it's a deal breaker for you to not have the screen, then don't do the upgrade. However, I'd much rather have the power. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching.